Today I'm going to talk a little bit about stories, about how we can hold our stories, how that will help us help our clients hold their stories. Creating a coherent narrative is what allows us to learn from our past and hold it and either make it the past or be able to find it in a file folder and use it as learning. When it's all discombobulated, it's not there and available for us. And so that is the purpose, in some ways, of getting people to create a narrative, is that it both renders it a past tense and also makes it available for learning. But the question is then, what do we do with ours? And actually last night I was like, I'm going to reread. I kept lots and lots of writing all throughout my training years. And it's a really tricky thing to figure out. How does my past that drove me to be a therapist, like, let's face it, between your noble purpose and your past, that's why you're sitting in a chair, right? You want to do something and impact the world, and there was something in your world that said, I should have an impact, right? Whether it's because it happened to me and I don't want it to happen to somebody else, or I watched it happen to somebody else and I don't want it to happen again. Whatever that was, it's in your ground. It's underneath your feet that you carry with you. And every client that comes to us carries something with them. I worked in Charlestown for a while and in Southie, and basically if you work in Boston, and you work with children, you'll have a caseload of Ryans. Like, I was working in a school once, and the teacher's yelling at this long row of children all lined up, and they're like, "Where's Ryan?" And the whole class goes, "Which one?" So and in this school, as a therapist, I had to have to go to the classroom and pick him up. And I'd go to pick him up, and every time I picked him up, he would reach into his pocket on the way to my office and pull something out and show it to me. And he would have always brought something from home, whether it was a mini Buzz Lightyear, I'm dating myself, or a car, or a army guy, or just something little that would have fit in his pocket. But it was his way of bringing his story, literally carrying his story from home and bringing it in. And our job is to figure out, so what do we do with that? How do we hold it? And he would try to figure out who I was. He had this game where he would draw a small line on the page and then another small line until I could guess what the picture was. Although, honestly, I don't think I could ever guess. And finally, at one point, I'm like, well, what is it? And he's like, it's a portrait of you if you were a duck. And he finished the whole drawing of him and me, literally, duck bill, but with my hair and my jumper that I was wearing that day. And, he's holding a story of me. Now, I might not actually be a duck, but there's some way in which I could float around in the world in a way he couldn't, right? So there was something about my story he was also trying to hold. So what does it mean to hold your own story as a therapist? What does it mean to work with it and hold it and have it serve the outcome of somebody's healing, right? Because we're there for somebody else, right? So just to give you a point of background, so I'm actually a German lit major undergrad, for anybody else who didn't come to this straight from psychology. And but when I surveyed everything I was doing I went to Mount Holyoke. Don't hold that against me. I looked at all my extracurriculars. I was with people. I created an eating disorder support group. I was a dorm president. I did all this stuff with people. And so I thought, all right, I'll either go into social work or psychology, and both graduate program worlds required that you had at least a year or two of work. So I went off. I was in Boston at the time, and I got a job at the Germain Lawrence School, which was a residential treatment facility for adolescent girls, and I started working with kids. And I stayed in that world for a very long time. I have to tell you, best training you will ever have in the whole world. Your clinical training, just so you know, even if you went off from here into corporate America, no one's as mean to you as a bunch of really angry teenagers. I've worked with CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, and it is way easier than group therapy with 10 really angry teenagers. So you are all set for the rest of your lives. But while I was working at Tremaine Lawrence, there was a consulting psychologist named Harry Parad. He used to run Wadico Services. He may still run Wadico Services if that still exists. But he was the inspiration for me, really, because he had a very compassionate view of kids. He broke down their behaviors into ways of really understanding things. And I thought, well, I'm going to be him, sort of, when I grow up. So I kind of chased psychology because of one person. And the funny thing is, you're going to be those people for other people. You are going to be out doing your job with beauty and passion, and some person who's working in your system is going to go, I want to be her, I want to be him, because you're inspirational. That's how this is a contagious world that we all work in. So I went on to psychology and was heading towards my goal was to run a child psych unit. Be chief psychologist in a child psych unit. That was my little career goal that I was aiming towards in my board game of life. And was almost there. And a friend of mine had started a consulting business in Philadelphia. And they had gotten a gig from the United Nations Development Program to help countries strengthen their response to HIV and AIDS. And two of the countries were post-conflict. There was South Africa and Cambodia. And so they asked me, because I had done so much work with trauma, to go down to Philadelphia and help them think about how do you teach emotional intelligence to people who've lived through trauma? Because our leadership program, the leadership program they were doing, was based in emotional intelligence. So I went down and helped them think about it and gave them my opinions. And I came back to Boston to finish my postdoc, and they called me up and said, come work for us. Don't go on and do this other thing. And so I sat with very much a fork in the road and decided to go in that direction. I decided to go work for a leadership development organization and spent 11 trips going to Cambodia over 4 years and working with people who'd lived through the Khmer Rouge and helping, but it was not a trauma intervention. I think what I want to also help you understand is there's a lot of ways to help people heal. And there's a lot of, what gets shattered in trauma isn't always just an individual's notion of themselves. In Cambodia, the social fabric of the country was destroyed. The trust between people was destroyed. And so our work of bringing people together and helping them talk and work as groups was what was healing, was what helped that country start pulling together in a different way. And so you can heal trauma not just by having one-on-one conversations, but also by very different groups and in very different interventions. So while I'm doing all this, I am starting to write a book on trauma because I've now seen it in so many different places. I've seen it in individual therapy, I've seen it in groups, I've seen it in residentials and inpatient, and now I've seen it on this large scale. And there are some patterns that are starting to occur to me. And I'm starting to see it in my own healing. So over that decade, I got a therapist because I was working with kids and my story was starting to impact my ability to hear other people's stories. So let me give you a couple examples. When I was in graduate school, the very first class I took was a family therapy class. And it was a small family therapy class because it was like an overflow class. So we met with the professor in her office. There were 4 of us. It was my very first class. I couldn't have been more intimidated. Like, I could barely breathe. And I was sitting at this table, and the very first thing the professor says is like, well, let's just get a sense of people's families. So in a few sentences, why don't you sum up your family? Yeah, no pressure, right? So I go first, and I look at everybody and I say, oh, guess standard family, mother, father, cat, dog, house in the suburbs. And that's all I said. And then everybody else went with an actual story. This is what happened, my parents got divorced. The people told story in whole sentences, not like little sound bites. And I sat there thinking, it's almost like that moment where you think the wrong life flashed in front of your eyes. And I went home, and for a while I was like, it's just stage fright. I was just scared to talk. And then I went to one of my clinical placements, and we had to do genograms. You all know genograms. So, you put up your whole family tree, and everybody's introducing it, and I start introducing it, and once again, can't string sentences together. Can't do it. So I drove home from that and was like, I don't think it's stage fright. I think I have a problem. So, shortly thereafter, I got a therapist and realized I do. I have some things I need to work through. And, there's a way in which you can carry your story and think, well, this makes me super compassionate. Like, I know what I lived through, I can understand what they've lived through, and it's a one-to-one. It's like I read the book, or I've hiked on that trail, so I know everything about that trail. And what you can gradually begin to hold is actually the problem with trauma, and most of the trauma I talk about in my book is something I call repeated trauma. So it's trauma that happens more than once, whether it's child abuse or domestic violence or war, gang violence. It's something that happens not just one time, but over the course of time. And it has a different impact on people. So repeated trauma, there is the what happened, but if with a one-time trauma, your body, as you guys know, your body gears up, right? If you're in a car accident or something like that, you release adrenaline, you release so much adrenaline that actually your receptors are super sensitive to it for a while, like a giant Velcro wall, right? But if you were in a car accident every single day for 4 or 5 years, your body can't gear up every single day. So instead, we start building protections so that we don't have to experience that. We go numb, we stop taking in data. So repeated trauma is not just what happened, it's also the protections that we create to survive it. And the third piece of repeated trauma is what didn't happen. So all the years that trauma is happening, you're not doing the things you need to do to develop and be healthy. Now that's true for individuals, it's true for countries. During war, Cambodia or Liberia or other places, they're not building roads, they're not building schools, they're not developing their economy, right? They're not growing. So whether it's at the individual level of system or the largest level of system, trauma shuts down growth. And in many ways, I look at healing as just a regeneration of growth. It's what needs to get pulled out of the way so that people can begin the process of growing again. And when people have experienced repeated trauma, that can be uncomfortable. The things that growth asks us to do, which is reach forward, reach toward relationship, risk things, feel scary for people who've survived trauma. So, that's the dance of helping people tolerate this kind of growth. I'm going to take a deep breath. And there are cards, just a little PSA moment. There are white cards if people have questions, and then I will also at some point pause, and you're free to ask any questions you want. So we have three forms of repeated trauma, right? What did happen, the protections, and what didn't happen. And I was really motivated to write this book because what I noticed in the work I was doing as a therapist was that people would run into, they would come into therapy, it would get harder before it got easier, and people would quit. Because people come to therapy to feel better, they really do. They're miserable, it takes people a long time to get to therapy. It takes them a long time. It's not like, ooh, I'm a little sad, I think I'll find a therapist, right? I used to joke in my internship placement that it's the third thing that brings people in. You can get through one hard thing. You can get through 2 hard things. Usually it's the third thing, fine, I'll get help, right? It takes people a long time. So by the time they get there, they're really in pain of some sort. And then there's a few moments, maybe the first few weeks, where they're like, oh, okay, I'm getting help. And you organize a few things, and they organize a few things. And after a while, they feel safe enough to start letting their story out, and then they feel worse, right? And the hard part is that that's not really common knowledge. And if it is common knowledge, it's buried in the books you guys get assigned in class, and not the ones people get on the shelves. And so I really wanted to write a book for the person who was going through the treatment to understand what the terrain looked like. I'm a hiker, or I was a hiker. At one point in my life, I was a hiker. And the White Mountain Guidebook for hiking. So I was on a hiking trip, and it was horrible. I was in super good shape. I was training for the US rowing team, like couldn't have been fitter. And yet, like, it was going straight up, straight down, straight up, straight down. And like by the second day, I was like, all right, I hope we're on the wrong, like what I wanted to do was open the book and say, like, you're absolutely on the wrong trail. Like, turn left and it'll be lovely, right? And instead, the description of this trail was a seemingly endless series of ups and downs. Which, just parenthetically, was the working title of my book for 6 years. So, but it's perfect. Like, that's what healing from trauma is. It is a seemingly endless series of ups and downs. And if you know that, like once I had the guidebook, I was like, all right, even if the guy, like, the guy who wrote the thing hiked all the time. Like, even if he thought it was bad or she thought it was bad, like, all right, fine, I'm in, right? But without a guidebook, it's really hard to know what to expect. And so from my experience, both working, all from individual all the way up to the country level, I created what I found to be a map for the healing cycle, right? And you guys learn this, it's a spiral, right? Growth, because growth is a spiral, and healing's really growth. So we're mixing two worlds. The psychology world, I don't know whether it's territory or what, likes to have everything in neat little swim lanes. Like, this is attachment, and this is, behavioral. And it's a spiral, you guys. You run into it, and you need all the information you can get. There's no part of psychology, I believe, that's optional. As much as you can learn, everywhere you can learn it, you will use it, I promise you that. And because some of the theories are really there to guide you to ask the right questions, or they're really there for questions. They're not necessarily always there for solutions, but they open up the problem. And some really help you understand the person, and some help you really understand a problem. So they're not all parallel either. So the model that I have starts with preparation. Now, for those of you who've read Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, so her model was 3 pieces, right? Safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. And as a trauma survivor, I didn't find the name safety all that helpful. Like, I get it as a therapist, and I think it is an important goal. But the problem is, if you live through repeated trauma, you don't have any inkling of what safety actually feels like. You have no notion of physically even what that feels like. And so to name it that, you always feel like, well, but it doesn't fit me. Or I'm doing it wrong. You spend a lot of time in, I'm doing it wrong. Whereas I decided to call it preparation. Yes, part of the goal is safety, but part of the goal is just getting somebody sort of fit enough and solid enough and have enough resources to head into the work of healing. And anybody can be preparing, even if they don't feel safe. Excuse me. The next stage, so what you can hang out in preparation for as long as you need. So some people come in with a boatload of resources. They can move on pretty fast, right? If you're taking somebody up Everest who's never walked more than a mile, it's going to take you a couple years to get them ready. If you take an ultra marathoner, they probably only have the standard year to prepare. But you wouldn't take anybody just up Everest. You have to help them prepare. So once somebody's gone through the preparation phase for a while, they start to feel safe enough in the therapy relationship to let go. And that's unintegration. That's the second phase. Pieces start coming apart. The protections that were keeping everything at bay start to loosen a little bit. We lower the drawbridge, right? Once pieces start coming up and out, you can start to name them. You can start to put words to them. I had a client who, she was a kid client who wanted to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle. She was working on kind of being patient. And so we got a 1,000-piece puzzle of emperor penguins. And we dumped out all the pieces. That's on integration. And we started sorting, which is the identification. We started like, but there's a lot of white between penguins, ice, and sky. So we'd pick it up and like, ice, sky, penguin, what do you think? And we started putting it into piles. This is hard and tedious work, and it is work. It's another piece of this puzzle, literally, of figuring it out. And the other thing is that it's iterative. So I think people imagine, in terms of holding your story, that you can come at this with kind of a linear, like, here's my story, here's what I know, this, wrap it up in a bow. It's one long, easy arc. And instead, people have trauma shatters. Your brain actually, at the moment of trauma, shuts down blood flow to the part of your brain that organizes language. So in traumatic experience, your trauma's not even like the label maker busted. Like there's no language assigned to it. So you've got to pull up thoughts, feelings, sights, experiences, all these different fragments, and start to add language to it so that you can create a story with it. And you'll see it differently. The first one you pull up, you may still have the view of it that you had when you were a kid. If you watched your parents fight when you were 7 and felt responsible for it, then the first thing you're going to come up with is guilt, like I didn't do what I was supposed to do. And as you go through the story again, you start to get a sense of scale, like wait, 7-year-olds are pretty small. It's not actually their job to pay attention to their parents in that way. You start to change the story. It's the same experience, but your meaning making grows over time. And just like, my client and I, we were sure some pieces were penguin, and they turned out to be sky, right? You change your story over time, not because you were lying, but because you get a better understanding, something's in perspective. And as the pieces come together, as you start to say, this is my experience, this is how I felt, this is what it means, that's integration. And that's when the past moves to the past. And that is a very different experience, because part of trauma is that it keeps you living in trauma. In some ways, it's trying to keep you alive. It's designed to make you hyper alert so that you don't miss the thing that would have killed you, right? I mean, if you think about it, the military traumatizes their recruits to get them hyper vigilant, and then gives them back agency through leadership, keeping the vigilance. So that part of the trauma response, the vigilance, has a huge survival value. But it becomes everything. You start living your whole life as if you know what's going to happen, because you're always looking for the thing that already happened, right? And that's the trauma piece of what didn't happen. You never get to lean into the future. You never get to wonder what will happen next, right? And that is part of learning, to be curious, to wonder. And trauma kind of takes that away. So that's an important piece. And once the past becomes the past, two things happen. You end up in somewhat a state of mourning, like that really happened. And you get this possibility of a new beginning, because there's a moment where you don't know. You get to live in a little bit of open space. And the last stage is consolidation, that there are times and breaks in healing where you slow down and just let things knit back together. Just absorb what you have just learned, just in the way you do in school, that you finish a class and then it sits in you for a while before you go use it. So the consolidation phase varies in time, and then you work your way back to preparation. Preparation of being what worked in our relationship that helped you heal, what didn't work, what would help you talk more, what would help you feel more safe or more comfortable. And so that's the 5 phases. And it's not a hard, it's not like you can have a little thing that says, oh, I know exactly where we are. But it helps people know what the work is for that phase, and it helps you organize yourself, or what to worry about, whether somebody's going to have a harder time or not. So, one thing I wanted to do was change the conversation from it being just an us, them. It's been my experience as a therapist going and getting CEU training or whatever, that there is an us, them, although I think the irony is hilarious because I've sat in too many rooms where I want to say so how many of us have been in therapy? Why are we talking about this as if we're not the ones also getting this, right? I'm a strong proponent of therapists having their own therapy, of doing your own work. And partly because it can interfere, what's unknown interferes. And also, I want you to have the respect of the work you're doing. I want you to know what it feels like to have said something hard. I want you to know what it feels like to drive home and not have said it, right? Both of those things. I want you to know what it feels like to wonder what the other person's thinking, right? To understand the power dynamic of the relationship. It's a useful power dynamic. It's a growth, we heal in relationship. We grow in relationship. I spend a lot of my time actually in the corporate world with big top team leadership teams, and I am on them about the fact that people grow in relationships, that supervisors and managers grow their people because that's how we were designed. We were born little with big people around us. And our brains orient off of that to lean in on them and grow with them. And so, we have to both respect that power dynamic and know what it can do. It's there for a reason. And I really wanted a different stance. I wanted a stance that was a we. And I want to be very clear, not a we as in, really that happened to you? Me too, right? It's not what I'm talking about. Sharing the details of your story is not what I'm talking about. What am I, 53? I have been suckered in by myself to share pieces of my story 3 times in my career, from childcare work to now. And I will tell you, 100% of that was a mistake. I was like, oh, this is the moment that my thing's gonna totally help, that Goodwill Hunting moment or whatever you want to call it, right? That it's gonna be a movie moment, and it's never a movie moment. It hasn't been for me. And I will tell you, part of the reason for that is that most people who have experienced trauma, your clients, if they hear that you have, the dynamic shifts that they want to take care of you. You become somebody in their world, and you don't know who that is all the time, and it is a chutes and ladders problem. So if you can learn from my mistakes, please do, or make your own. But that's not what I'm talking about. But I am talking about the fact that our trauma histories can be a source of our own humanity, right? That I, like you, have lived through something hard. I, like you, understand that human beings go through this, and they make it, and they survive, and they can give back, right? I can hold the hope that I have created for myself. I can use that hope and kind of channel it out, right? The other reason that I really stay away from my own particular story, so in this book, I think there are 7 or 8 sentences of my own story, honestly. There's less than 200 words of my own story. And the truth is, the world has a hard time with trauma stories. There are members of my own family who are no longer speaking to me because of this book for 7 sentences. And the New York Times book review was like, she doesn't say anything, right? So those are the extremes of the same book. But the truth of the matter is that the details of my particular story are very important to me. They inform who I am. But I have worked in contexts now where they're really not important to the other people. So, part of the leadership work that I did in Cambodia for 4 years, that was really helping leaders strengthen their response to whatever was going on. And I took that model, and I've been using it in Alaska, doing work with Alaska Native leaders in their rural communities, their tribes outside of outside of Fairbanks, to help them strengthen the response to the problems that their communities are having. Domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, substance use, depending on what they wanted to pick. And the truth of the matter is, when I go up there isn't anything in their stories I actually haven't experienced as a person. And I will tell you, it couldn't matter less. Because in rural Alaska, I'm also the perpetrator, right? I'm a white woman from away. And so I have to hold both of those sides of the story. That I have that experience as a survivor, but I also represent the perpetrator. And that is true in a lot of places I go. And so that's why you can't hold your story as so precious as the I totally get you, because you get humanity, you get injustice, right? But you don't necessarily get their story. So the context is really important. And that, social workers understand this inherently. You guys understand systems, right? Levels of system, the nested models of systems, and understand that an individual, you're impacted by the context you're in, right? I bring this into organizations, I bring this into a lot of other places because a lot of people don't get that there's multiple layers of this for healing from trauma. Just checking on the time. Okay, all right. So why don't I slow down and see if there are any questions, because we have about 15 minutes left. Yes?
So I really appreciate you discussing the balance about sharing your story and keeping it and the different perspectives. I found that a lot, it's easier for many people to talk about racial trauma, social injustice. You can even say we were victims of it. But when it comes to interpersonal trauma, there's a large silence around it. And the fact is, when many people don't talk about interpersonal silence, that's when we perpetuate interpersonal silence. And victims, especially of sexual abuse, are learned that just don't talk about it, which feeds into the ability of the perpetrator to re-victimize the victims. How do we navigate this whole silence and sharing and keeping a personal story while upholding truth?
If I had an answer, I think what we need to do is keep that question alive, because to me it feels like if you ever had a necklace knotted in your drawer, it feels like we don't quite, I think it's a knot. Like I feel like we pull on one side of it and something else gets tighter. I can tell you from my experience that, if you're the victim of some larger injustice, then there are those bad guys. It's a group on group. It's a different level of system, right? If you're an individual saying that person hurt me, then you're kind of almost in your own private court of law. Well, did it really happen? Would they say it happened? And we're down to libel, and we're down to things where you feel like, can I legitimately say this out loud, right? But I also think that we have to create places where people can safely say it out loud from the individual level, whether that's groups or whether that's, now it's happening on social media, but I don't think that's the safest place for it. But I think keep asking because I don't even know, I don't know that we have a larger sense of what the resistance is, right? Is it just safety? I will lose we're pack animals, right? So will I lose my tribe, my clan, my pack by speaking out? And is there some truth to that we don't want to say, yeah, go ahead, risk it, and then you're ostracized? Or is that not true and there's something else underneath it, right? So that's your book to write. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to formulate this question, so I'm just gonna try
Go
to
for
it. Okay. So I'm curious about how you might in your experience approach a client who comes in and is talking about an experience they've had, and you're like, oh my God, this is clearly trauma, but they're not really aware of it as trauma. And how do you kind of explore that with them without being like, you have trauma, and they're like, what? Are you, so.
Yeah. Right, so I think that's a great question, because we have to be careful what we name things right? So I've worked in a number of communities where people are like, I'm not a survivor, that's just my life, right? I'm proud, actually, of what I've done, right? So we can come in with this mindset like, oh my God, you're totally traumatized. And they're like, actually, I'm doing okay, right? Or I'm not ready to see it any other way, right? However you want to frame it. So I think the bigger piece is trying to sort out how is that story impacting them? What meaning do they make out of the story they're telling you, right? Who else have they told that story to? Sort of expand on the context of the story rather than go for the meaning you're making of it. And it doesn't mean you're not right. This is the interesting thing. So it took me a number of tries to get a decent therapist. And I was like, I think it was like in the old HMO world, this is late 90s. And I went to one guy, and he basically laid out my whole life in like 5 sentences. And he wasn't wrong. But that in 50 cents, like it didn't matter that he was right. And it was such a good lesson for me before I was sort of really a therapist to realize being right doesn't matter. Like you win the Jeopardy thing, but nothing moves, right? So I think there are moments where we can hear things and just hold it. And it gives us an idea of like, whoa, that's a big mountain they want. Like they're not going up the Catskills, right? There's a big mountain ahead of them if they choose to do it. And then later on, there's also moments of context, like if they start having a hard time, you can be like, actually, I heard the story is kind of bigger than that. And this is how I understood it, right? But that's a different time. But it's a really good thing to pay attention to.
So I think and a lot of folks here are interested in social advocacy or social justice in like a meso-macro lens, but are also interested in clinical work. And I think it's hard to be like, I want to like produce this art around my trauma and my experience and like perform it in this public way, either like through performance art or on social media or like whatever. And also like making it public and makes it potentially accessible to clients. So it might be more of a practical question of like how to either get around that or acknowledge that or integrate that. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, we're cutting edge here because in the old days, so if you think about it, like Alice Miller outed her story at the very end of her career. Who's Marshall Linehan, did it after she did all her writing, right? And I put it in my book, but I have the world's smallest private practice because I do mostly consulting work, and I basically closed it because I'm never home. You just can't like abandon people all the time. It's wrong. Yeah. So, but I think that I actually, just to share, I was really worried even about my consulting work with this book coming out. There was like a before and after, like as I was heading towards the date in February when it was going to come out, I was like, am I going to lose my whole career? Like, am I going to have to shift only into this world? And the funny thing is, either people completely ignore it, which most people do, just by the way. Like 90% of people will ignore most of what you do out in the world. They'll ignore, and about 80% will ignore what you say in the session, so you don't have to worry that much. But for the 10% who do, some of the people are like, hey, that's awesome. Like I have had vice presidents of organizations come up and be like, I read your book, I have a trauma history, I think it's great. And you're like, oh my God, I had no idea. And you have to decide kind of what world you want to stay in. Because it's also, it is a decision you're making about how out you want to be about that and what kind of conversations and worlds you want to work in. I chose to go at a much higher level of system with the book. And part of that is I'm not going to go out one-on-one and meet with people and hold that responsibility. And that is a decision I'm making. And it's a loss. It was a loss to close my practice. But I decided to do that. So I think that there is no such thing as blank screen anymore. The internet's a wild place. There are notes from an interview I did to get a job at Wellesley College in like 1990 up on the internet. Like, things just get put on the internet. So there isn't a blank screen anymore. Your clients will find stuff out about you, but most of the time, they're gonna ignore it. So I think that the other thing is, I think amongst yourselves, you should be having these conversations about what you're trying to do and what your experiences are. Because you're leading the charge in more than I am. Because I'm still part of the old guard in many ways. And you guys are there. Social media, didn't exist while I was trying to do this. I want this plug though. Ignore branding, all right? It's the cart before the horse. Don't try to decide who you are and then go be that. Be who you are and become something, all right? Like, it's just a backwards view of the world, and I keep running into people who are like, I have to find my niche. And I'm like, no, you have to go work, and your niche will find you. It really will.
This too isn't a super formulated question, but I think it's because I'm personally starting to think about it. We talk about the relationship with the client and what's being said, that type of relationship, your relationship with yourself. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious about our experiences with like loved ones who have trauma. Mm-hmm. And just, I'm just personally starting to think about it when you're, with your kids, your parents, your best friend, your partner in life, right. And just that type of relationship.
That's a great question. So that was the other motivation for my book, was that for a lot of, let's say, military spouses or people who are with loved ones who've experienced trauma, it's hard to understand what they're going through. And one of the biggest issues is that loving relationships are healing, but they're not going to really heal repeated trauma. Partly because it's just the person who's gone through trauma doesn't really want you to see those pieces. For good reason, actually. They need you to love them, and they need you to have some space where they're not all their trauma, right? And that no matter who you are, whether it's your loved one or your client or you, like, trauma's one of the pie wedges in your Trivial Pursuit pie wedge thing. Not all of your wedges. And the healthy relationships in our lives, the holding relationships in our lives, help us with our other wedges. They help us remember that we have an anchor in the present. And I think in some ways it's not unlike if one of your loved ones wanted to go up Everest. Like, you can't carry the bag for them, but you can, or let's make it the Appalachian Trail. Like, you can drop off food, you can send them letters, right? You can cheer them on, but you can't do it for them. And I think that's the kind of cheerleader, I got your back, I'm sticking with you, I'm here no matter what. The same I would say even if they didn't have a trauma history, but it's trickier when they do. And this goes without saying, but I don't really think you're going to heal from repeated trauma without a healing relationship. Whether that's individual therapy, whether that's group therapy. If you're a country, it's sometimes a non-governmental organization, but something that helps hold the healing place for people, the container for it.
Can you talk about pre-verbal trauma? My son was in an orphanage
Yeah.
his first year of life.
Yeah.
And how that impacts healing. Because it's not just love that's going to help.
No. Pre-verbal, the problem with that first year is it just takes a long time to heal from it. And it's a mix, right? So this is true of your son, but it's true of a lot of people, which is depending on their temperament, they can more or less, he may roll with more things or not with more things, right? And you don't always know what he got and didn't get in the orphanage, right? Whether there was somebody more looking after him than not, or you don't know. But what you can do is give him all the resources. Pre-verbal, you need all the resources to head into a relationship where you can lean and play with it. Now, I will say this about children. They heal faster than grown-ups. They just do. In my years of doing kid work, a few, like it always felt like pulling a few things out of the way and zoom, they were off. And the healing is kind of intermittent. And this is true of all of us, right? So what can happen is he can like zoom on, you know, and maybe hit a rough patch at 9 or hit a rough patch at 13 and that's true of all of us. Like people will say like, well, I already did therapy for that, right? Everybody nods, right? But at each developmental milestone, as you go in through another developmental round, development means reintegration, which means you kind of reintegrate your past in a new way. You make meaning of it differently. For any of you who read Catcher in the Rye when you were in middle school, when you read it again as an adult, it doesn't feel at all like it did when you were 14 because you make meaning of it differently. You integrate it differently into who you are. And the same is true of trauma, and the same is true of kid trauma. So kids can run at it, and they can make it a really long way. They can get, you know, a lot of trauma shows back up in your 30s, partly because that's when old defenses kind of start breaking down. And it's like, you know, that's the 180,000 mile checkup for your car or whatever. You're like, you're gonna have to spend $8,000 you need in a car. And you're like, all right, fine, I'm going in, right? So first of all, I have a lot of hope. People heal from trauma, they really do. But it's not a permanent healing. It's not a cure. It's just that you open back up to life and occasionally need tune-ups. Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about intergenerational trauma?
Yes. So a lot of the work I was doing in Alaska, that was the main thrust of the conversation. Unhealed trauma, the thing about trauma is it wants to get healed. It really does. So if you don't do anything at all, the story will try to come out because often it's relational through the relationships that are around. I don't have a therapist, I'll work it out with my kid, right? And not because people are evil, but because it's trying to get healed, right? And that those are the closest people around. And it can happen over and over, right? And you know, it's hard enough if it's just a family system doing that, but in many of our communities and hurt communities, we're looking at it as a community issue, right? In Alaska, you have the intergenerational trauma, you have the generation that were killed off because their blankets had smallpox. You have the next generation whose children were all taken to boarding school and to de-Indian them, right? And then they come back and raise children. And they had no attachment capacity. So now they're trying to raise kids, and they don't understand what it means to be parented because they were never parented, right? So you could go at that on an individual level, like you need to learn how to parent, or you have to start trying to figure out, this especially, you guys are social workers and you're gonna be in community systems, asking yourself, all right, where's the lever here, right? We could work with one family at a time in this community, or we could say, whoop, we need some sort of parent leadership class, right? We need a community action group. We need to build a playground. We need to there's some other way to get at this intergenerational trauma than one family at a time. Because often it's hard to intervene right directly at a family. They don't often want you in, but if you have the ability to get in through a community access or give them, lean into their strengths, not just their pathology, you'll have a lot more luck.
I just was wondering if you could speak to what it's been like in your experience to sit in kind of a perpetrator role, and also how you've helped clients who have been in both roles.
So when you sit in the perpetrator, I feel like as a therapist, you're always in the perpetrator role, sort of. You're always representing some bad guy in somebody's life, or the ability to hold that bad guy's position if you need to. It's part of your job. So I've actually found that I lean on that a lot when I'm in larger groups, of knowing that sometimes people need to have you hold the bad guy so they can figure out their story in relation to the bad guy in their world, whether that's at the community level or just the individual level. And the other piece is, by being able to hold that for myself, it's helped me work with perpetrators, because I know I'm not all bad, right? And I know I hold more than just in any one story. So it helps me, you know, I did my dissertation with juvenile delinquent boys in lockup, and I did meditation groups, and it really helped me hold their side of the story, that they're not just the perpetrators of crimes or abuse. They also had their own story of being perpetrated against, that, you know, we're all both. I mean, and at different levels. I'm not saying you're all criminals or anything, but like, you hold both.
One more question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, not everybody, in what ways can you support healing and trauma for somebody that like Western therapy, that whole model doesn't really serve, or it's just not a good fit?
I would work with them to find a community that did. So I know even in the substance use world, there's a Buddhist side of it. There's different community groups. Some people choose kind of a religion or organized religion world. Some people would choose nature and the more natural world, but I would work with them to find some place that did. And maybe work with them to find a therapist who also doesn't fit the Western model. You know, I mean, in the work we did in Cambodia, it didn't look like a Western model at all. And it wasn't therapy, but it was a container for healing. So, well, thank you very much. I know you guys have other places to go, but it was great to be here, and good luck. Charge on.